to himself as ever, Rousseau now chose to abandon opera. Such theatre was simply another example of corrupting civilization. He embarked upon a period of austere moral self-reform, deciding it was time for him to re-embrace the strict principles of Calvinism that had permeated his childhood in Geneva. He would return to his native city, cast aside the corruption of Catholicism, and live a proper life amidst a proper society. All went surprisingly well, and Rousseau was welcomed with open arms by the citizens of Geneva, who were flattered by the return of their famous son. The Discourse on Inequality had not won the prize offered by the Academy of Dijon, but it had aroused huge public interest. Rousseau was on the way to becoming the most talked-about figure in France. No longer did it matter that les philosophes now considered his ideas anathema to their Enlightenment views. Throughout Europe, the classical restraint of the Enlightenment was on the verge of giving way to a new, unrestrained romanticism. Rousseau would become both the embodiment and the spokesman of this revolution in sensibility. And more surprisingly, the upright citizens of Geneva even managed to tolerate the presence of Rousseau's illiterate mistress Thérèse. Rousseau's self-reform had not gone so far as to include marriage to his washerwoman companion. In Geneva, she was simply passed off as a nurse. The fact that this nurse had no children to look after, other than Rousseau himself, was even more scandalous had the truth been known, for Thérèse had by now given birth to no less than 5 children. How many of these were actually Rousseau's has remained a matter of prurient scholarly speculation. Where were they when Rousseau arrived with their mother in Geneva? We now come to the grimmest unorthodoxy in Rousseau's determinedly unorthodox life. Each of these 5 children had been delivered shortly after its birth to the Foundlings' Home, down the road from where he lived in Paris. At various times in his life, Rousseau would offer various inadequate excuses for this unpalatable fact. These ranged from the intellectual. Plato maintained that all children should be brought up by the state, to the psychological. Children don't like the company of old people. He was now in his 40s. The truth is that to be himself, to be true to his difficult nature and fulfill himself as one of the most original thinkers of the 18th century, Rousseau was willing to sacrifice everything. Temperament was all. Such self-centeredness, such monstrous egoism, could tolerate the presence of no other child in its life. Rousseau made little effort to conceal what he had done. He was aware of his guilt, and he suffered from it. As far as his life is concerned, these 5 children tip the scales very heavily against him, and his writings should not be separated from his life. Indeed, they drew so heavily upon it that such would be impossible. On the other hand, we must ask, does his life fatally compromise his ideas? However grudgingly, I think that in this instance the answer must be no. Rousseau's ideas would prove to be a major contribution to human self-understanding, on the personal, social, psychological, and philosophical levels. We are all his inheritors, for better or for worse. We can deplore his actions, we can ridicule his irrationalities, but his ideas inform such a wide aspect of our lives that our present existence is inconceivable without them. Beware the moralist who abandons his children. Never was a slogan more cause for self-examination. Rousseau became a citizen of Geneva, and was then accepted back into the Calvinist communion, despite reservations in some quarters. Living in Geneva, he rediscovered the beauties of nature, marvelling at the snow-peaked Alps, rowing across the blue waters of Lake Geneva to the Valois shore, walking up in the foothills to where the waterfalls cascaded through the ravines. Amidst the vast spaces of the mountains, he would lose himself in reverie. I do not think, I do not reason, I feel myself with a kind of voluptuousness possessed of the substance of the universe. But he also had to work, to provide money for himself and Thérèse. Despite his rejection of the corrupting arts, he decided to write a play. The theatre was forbidden in Geneva, and after some months he set out on a visit to Paris. He intended to set his affairs in order before returning to live permanently in Geneva. But it was not to be. Once back in Paris, Rousseau began his round of the salons, where he was flattered to be lionized by society hostesses. He began accepting hospitality at a number of country estates. Finally, he decided once more that he was tired of the corruptions of civilization. What he needed was solitude amidst nature, where he could be his natural self, where he could marvel at the simple joys of the natural world, and be free to write out his thoughts without interruption. In 1758, he left his meagre rooms in Paris to live on the country estate of Madame d'Épinay at Montmorency, in the woods just beyond the northern outskirts of the city. Rousseau was installed at the Hermitage, a restored hunting lodge in a secluded part of the woods, along with Thérèse. Inevitably, there were complications. Madame d'Épinay had a crush on her famous romantic protégé. It had long been recognized that Thérèse was more than simply Rousseau's nurse, but her coarse appearance and behavior were generally considered to be no threat where his true romantic passions were concerned. Rousseau's relationship with Madame d'Épinay may or may not have remained chaste. It is known that she had another lover during this period, but it is evident that something in Rousseau's multifarious emotional life remained unfulfilled. Enraptured by his new surroundings, Rousseau embarked upon a novel, Julie, which was prompted by a desire for loving which I had never been able to satisfy and by which I felt myself devoured. He claimed that it expressed his longing for an idealized love, though the novel itself was deeply concerned with physical love, especially that aspect of it that appealed to Rousseau's sexuality. The young male hero, a tutor, is seduced by a beautiful, domineering, aristocratic woman. In an ecstasy of passion, he declares to her, "Julie, you were made to rule. Your empire is the most absolute I know. Your spirit crushes mine. I am nothing in your presence." One can all but hear the swish of the cane that first aroused the 8-year-old boy. Then one day, while Rousseau was immersed in writing his novel, a woman arrived at the Hermitage wearing boots, piercing the air with peals of laughter. She had long, wavy black hair which reached to her waist, was wearing riding breeches, and was caked up to her knees in mud. This was Madame Sophie Dudentot, a local aristocratic lady who was in fact Madame d'Épinay's sister-in-law. She even had the same full bosoms as Julie, a feature to which Rousseau draws frequent attention in the novel. Inevitably, Rousseau was smitten with love for this dark dominatrix, who quickly became Julie in his novel. Rousseau would accompany her on walks in the woods. They would pause beneath a particular acacia tree, and Rousseau would begin reading to her the passionate love letters that the young tutor addressed to Julie in his novel. For her part, Sophie encouraged him, and then at the last moment would upbraid him with harsh reproaches for taking liberties, a little realizing that this was precisely what Rousseau desired. He was soon driven to a state of amorous delirium in which he experienced all the delights of erotic fervour. It wasn't long before Madame d'Épinay got wind of this. Although her affair with Rousseau had gone dormant, she was not amused. She wrote to him, "After long showing you every possible mark of friendship and sympathy for several years, there is nothing left for me but to pity you." Rousseau was obliged to leave the Hermitage, but was given alternative accommodations by the powerful Marechal de Luxembourg in a remote cottage on the edge of the Montmorency woods. Despite all this emotional turbulence, Rousseau's 4 years at Montmorency were to prove the most creative period of his life. The most important work of these years was his social contract. This opens with the ringing declaration, "Man was born free, and everywhere he is in chains." Liberty is an essential part of our humanity. To renounce freedom is to renounce one's human quality. In his Discourse on Inequality, Rousseau had suggested that this was inevitable when natural man came together to form society. Now he suggests otherwise. There is a solution to this problem. Human beings are not corrupted if they form a society by entering into a genuine social contract. This latter term presents another historical fiction which is intended as a social parable. When individuals come together to form a society, they must each contract to surrender something, and in return the society gives them something back. This is the hypothetical social contract. In the Discourse, Rousseau shows how individuals surrender their freedom in return for protection of their property and other civil rights. Rousseau now insists that it is possible for a genuine social contract to take place between human beings so that they still retain their freedom and thus their humanity. In exchange for their natural freedom, they must be given a better freedom, namely political freedom. Rousseau introduces himself in the social contract as a man who has every right to hold forth about justice and the rights of the citizen. He may not be a powerful ruler or a prince with experience in such matters, but he is nonetheless a sovereign. As a citizen of the Free State of Geneva, he is its sovereign. His democratic rights make him a ruler of the city. Rousseau is skating on thin ice here. He refers to Geneva a number of times in the social contract, and in glowing terms, but the Geneva he now refers to is the Geneva established more than 2 centuries earlier by Calvin. The reality Rousseau had experienced during his return visit in 1754 had evidently proved something of a disappointment. At one point he even goes so far as to describe contemporary Geneva as a dictatorship run by 25 of this revolution in sensibility. And more surprisingly, the upright citizens of Geneva even managed to tolerate the presence of Rousseau's illiterate mistress Thérèse. Rousseau's self-reform had not gone so far as to include marriage to his washerwoman companion. In Geneva, she was simply passed off as a nurse. The fact that Rousseau was on the way to becoming the most talked-about figure in France. No longer did it matter that les philosophes now considered his ideas anathema to their Enlightenment views. Throughout Europe, the classical restraint of the Enlightenment was on the verge of giving way to a new, unrestrained romanticism. Rousseau would become both the embodiment and the spokesman of Catholicism and live a proper life amidst a proper society. All went surprisingly well, and Rousseau was welcomed with open arms by the citizens of Geneva, who were flattered by the return of their famous son. The Discourse on Inequality had not won the prize offered by the Academy of Dijon, but it had aroused huge public interest. This nurse had no children to look after, other than Rousseau himself, was even more scandalous had the truth been known, for Thérèse had by now given birth to no less than 5 children. How many of these were actually Rousseau's has remained a matter of prurient scholarly speculation. Where were they when Rousseau arrived with their mother in Geneva? We now come to the grimmest, unorthodox to himself as ever, Rousseau now chose to abandon opera. Such theatre was simply another example of corrupting civilization. He embarked upon a period of austere moral self-reform, deciding it was time for him to re-embrace the strict principles of Calvinism that had permeated his childhood in Geneva. He would return to his native city, cast aside the corrupt